this video, I want to talk to you about mid-side EQ and why this is such a hugely powerful tool in allowing us to sculpt our tracks and create clarity, space and balance in our mixdowns. So mid-side EQ gives you a much more sophisticated form of control over your stereo and mono content, as opposed to, say, the utility tool in Ableton, which does a very good job at simply narrowing and expanding the width of your stereo content. Now, these two tools used in combination with each other can be a very powerful team in establishing this kind of sonic universe that you're trying to fit everything into. Now, in the last video on controlling the stereo field, and if you haven't seen that, I'd really recommend you have a look at it. It's on my YouTube channel. In the previous video, we spoke about specifically the stereo field and why it's important to control it. In this video, I want to focus more on the mid-side EQ and how this slightly more nuanced approach can get us some really great results in terms of that kind of clarity and that control. So here we have our audio example. And as a refresher, we have an auto filter here at the bottom, which is just basically just allowing us to cut off some of the bottom end. So it's a high pass filter effectively, or a low cut filter. And we are just cleaning up the bottom end of the sample. Now we're doing that in just regular mode. This isn't a mid-side process in this particular case. We are going to take this utility and keep the width here at 100%. And then again, we're going to be using Voxengo Span. There's a freely downloadable version of this available if you'd like to check it out. Has a great feature where you can reveal the middle and side content of your audio simultaneously, so you can see side by side exactly what's happening effectively with the relationship between the two, and that's very important here. So as I said in the previous tutorial, as a rule of thumb, I try to avoid there being an excess of stereo content in a single sample, but also in the track as a whole. If the level of the stereo content exceeds the level of the mono content, it tends to feel quite unnatural and quite weird. So in the case of this part, rather than using the utility to reduce some of that sound, we're going to use this mid-side EQ. Now this is just Ableton's EQ8. If you're not aware of it already, it's available in mid-side mode as well as its regular stereo mode. And to activate mid-side mode, we just go to this drop-down menu. By default, it appears in stereo mode, so it affects the middle and the side of our sound equally. But in mid-side mode, it allows us to specify either the mono content or the stereo content, and that's extremely handy. If we now play this sample, you can see that at the top end here, and this is around about 13k 12k upwards, there is an excess of stereo content, and actually there's a lot of stereo content in the very top end of this sample generally. So rather than turn down the stereo spread of the entire thing and lose some of the nice qualities that maybe the high mids have with their stereo spread, what we can do is we can use this mid-side EQ in mid-side mode, or the EQ8 in mid-side mode, and simply put on a high cut filter or a low pass filter and just roll off some of that super shiny top end, and then we'll see what happens to the span here. Bring it back in. You can actually hear that harshness coming in. But with the mid-side processing there, what we've done is we've simply affected the stereo content of that particular sample and just reduced some of the really nasty top end content. Now for me as well, I'm hearing quite a lot of stereo content in this kind of mid-range, particularly from the hi-hats, or the upper mids rather. And again, we can play around with this and just find exactly where that sort of offending stereo content lies. For me, I'd probably look at maybe ducking it a little bit here, and then using a low cut or a high pass filter, and maybe losing some of this sort of mid-range content. And you can see the effect that's having here on the span graph. You can see that the stereo content, which is in this lighter color here, is diminishing as I move this filter upwards. And eventually it would disappear altogether and just become a mono sample. We want to maintain some of that kind of mono content because it's, you know, it's kind of helpful to us, I think. But we don't want too much of it. So this particular bit of EQing here is, you know, I'm not sure if it's entirely necessary now. We've used that filter, but it does actually then cut out just some of this mid-range information. So what that's done to the sample is it's just sort of mitigated some of the harshness, particularly in that stereo content, and it's just brought the elements back together a little bit in terms of their sort of sonic union. And for me, that's still a touch on the wide side because I'm just thinking about maybe other sonic elements that we might be bringing into play within our drum bus. So what I would probably do is take the width down to about 50%. And that's going to reduce the level of the stereo content altogether. Maybe even further. So you can see it still has some stereo content, but it doesn't have any now at all in this kind of mid-range area. And the content is very much like focused around that sort of 6 to 10K area, which is quite a sweet spot, I think, for this particular sample. Now I think now we have a sample that will fit much more comfortably with the other rhythmic elements, and if we A/B it, you'll see the difference pretty starkly. Now if you did feel that because you've lost some of that kind of stereo field that some of the sharpness has gone from the high ends, then one possibility is actually to drop, to put in some shaping EQ to either very gently boost at the very top end, or more likely kind of scoop a little bit more sound out of that kind of upper mid-range. But that's, that's a job for the finessing department, which we'll come to later on in this series of tutorials. So let's now have a very quick listen to our beat-free pad here, and this is just a further example of a similar thing. So without the mid-side processing on here, there's no adjustment going on within the utility. And we know that this particular sound is very much a kind of mid-range sound. We're not really looking for anything from this sound other than that beautiful sort of warm mid-range. So again, this sound particularly, we can look at the stereo spread. We can exaggerate that and just refresh our memories on what it sounds like when the stereo content is overly loud. It just sounds really quite unnatural. And it doesn't sound as unnatural as it would if you were really boosting the frequencies lower down. So the lower the frequencies are within the spectrum, where you have a whole ton of stereo content, the more unnatural the sound tends to become. So it's very important that you look at sounds kind of below about 500 hertz and just figure out whether there's a good reason to have that stereo content there. And I'll often look at using one of these mid-side EQs to roll off some of the bottom end, and also I'll make sure that there's virtually no content at all in that realm happening below about 150 hertz, sometimes 200 hertz. So if we just bring into play this EQ now, and this is the mono side of the signal, because we don't want any of this sub bass in here, right? And in the stereo side of the signal, we have a more radical curve where we're actually losing some of that bottom end. Let me just reset this width. It's quite a more natural sound. And with this sound, I'd probably even take a touch more width out of it, and then maybe in the processing stage I might look at adding a little bit of reverb just to give it more of a sort of natural width, rather than trying to promote the width from within the sample to become super wide. Adding some reverb onto that, I think, would make it sit more naturally within the track. The other thing that I've done here with this EQ, with the stereo EQ, is just put in a little curve here to cut some of the more like top end signals, and we can wind that in like this. You can see here that we're losing some of the higher frequencies now of this content, and that's just ensuring that the sound retains some of that real warmth and that sort of fuzzy analog glow that we're looking for. So there are just a couple of examples of how you can use mid-side EQ to sculpt your sounds. You can obviously become, you can get very, very granular with this. You can get into some real sort of detail work with pulling down very specific frequencies. The main thing, I think, is to remember to listen. So don't just follow the graphs, don't just follow the science. The science may tell you one thing, but the ears are actually telling you, actually, that's quite a pleasing sound. There are certain instances, I think, where these spectrum analyzers, for example, are super useful, like in sub-bass frequencies that are maybe inaudible to us, or we haven't really picked up on because we haven't trained ourselves to listen to them too hard. But don't just be a slave to the science here. Remember, you're creating art. So, there is decision making that you should be making on the basis of whether you like it and whether it sounds good to you. I hope you've enjoyed this video. If you have, then please like and subscribe to my YouTube channel, where you'll find a whole bunch of other similar content. And also please check out my website at mixingmasteringmentoring.com, where you can find a whole bunch of different mixing, mastering and mentoring services, as well as one-to-one mentoring sessions. It's also a great place to check out all of these tutorials in one place, and you'll also find some free PDFs for downloading, which will really help you, I think, turbocharge your own productions. So I hope you've enjoyed the video, and I will see you again soon. You can download a PDF cheat sheet of the information contained in this tutorial from the link in the description below.